Two men are sitting across a table from the most powerful video company on earth. They flew in from California. They don't have much money. They don't have much time. And what they're about to ask for, $50 million, is, by almost any measure, a desperate gamble. The men on the other side of that table run a company with 9,000 stores, $5 billion in annual revenue, and 60 million members. They are not worried about these two men from California, not even a little. What happened in that room didn't just destroy one company. It became the most studied business failure of the 21st century. And the part everyone thinks they know? They've been getting it wrong for 20 years. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what Blockbuster was in the year 2000. It wasn't just a store. It was a Friday night ritual for tens of millions of American families, 9,000 locations across the globe, 60 million members, $5 billion in annual revenue. In the United States alone, Blockbuster was so embedded in the culture that the phrase "be kind, rewind" was something children learned before they learned to drive. The company had survived the transition from Betamax to VHS. It had expanded internationally. It had withstood every challenger that tried to enter its market. By 2000, Blockbuster's leadership genuinely believed, and had good reason to believe, that they had won. The video rental industry was theirs. It wasn't a question of if competitors would emerge. It was a question of how quickly Blockbuster would absorb or outlast them. So when Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph, co-founders of a small, still unprofitable DVD-by-mail startup called Netflix, walked into Blockbuster headquarters in Dallas, they weren't walking into a company that felt threatened. They were walking into a company that felt untouchable. The meeting was Reed Hastings' idea. Netflix was burning through money, nearly $60 million in losses that year alone. The dot-com bubble was collapsing around them, and Hastings believed the fastest path forward wasn't to compete with Blockbuster. It was to become part of it. Hastings, Randolph, and Netflix CFO Barry McCarthy sat across from Blockbuster CEO John Antioco and the company's general counsel. The pitch, according to Mark Randolph's own account in his book That Will Never Work, was direct. Netflix would run Blockbuster's online operation. In exchange, Blockbuster would promote Netflix in its stores. The asking price? $50 million. Antioco's reaction, by multiple accounts, was not anger. It wasn't even suspicion. It was something closer to quiet dismissal. The dot-com hysteria, in his view, was exactly that. Hysteria. Netflix was an interesting little company losing money in a niche market. And $50 million was not a number Blockbuster's leadership spent much time considering. The meeting ended. Hastings and Randolph flew back to California. Netflix was worth at that moment somewhere between nothing and a rounding error in Blockbuster's quarterly report. Within a decade, it would be worth more than Blockbuster had ever been worth in its entire history. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Blockbuster's CEO John Antioco, the man in that room, disputes that the $50 million offer ever happened. Not the meeting itself, just the offer. In his version, the conversation was exploratory, not transactional. A partnership discussion, not an acquisition pitch. Two sides, one room, and a decision so consequential that both parties remember it differently. The truth is, it doesn't matter who's right about the number. Because the real reason Blockbuster was doomed had almost nothing to do with that meeting at all. The story you've been told goes like this. Blockbuster was arrogant, they laughed at Netflix, and they paid the price. It's a clean story. It's also incomplete. Start with the money. In 2000, Blockbuster collected roughly $800 million per year in late fees. That wasn't incidental revenue. It was structural. Late fees were baked into the financial model, the store operations, the earnings guidance Wall Street expected. Eliminating them wasn't a strategic choice Blockbuster could make quietly. It was an earthquake. Then there was Viacom. The media conglomerate had acquired Blockbuster in 1994, and from that point on, Blockbuster's strategy was increasingly shaped by what was good for Viacom: cross-promotions for Paramount Films, merchandise partnerships, brand synergy, rather than by what was good for the video rental business. When Blockbuster's leadership wanted to invest $400 million in their digital transition, the internal resistance wasn't from ignorance. It was from shareholders and a parent company that didn't want the short-term earnings hit. And there were people inside Blockbuster who saw it clearly. CEO John Antioco, for all his skepticism of Netflix in 2000, would eventually launch an aggressive digital strategy. His chief operating officer understood the threat. Internal advocates pushed, wrote memos, made the case. They were ignored. Not because the company was stupid, because the company was optimized for something else entirely, and optimized systems are extraordinarily hard to redirect, even when the people running them can see the wall coming. Which brings us to the one moment where Blockbuster almost, genuinely almost, pulled it off. In 2007, Blockbuster launched a program called Total Access, and for a brief, remarkable window, it worked. Total Access let customers return DVDs by mail and exchange them in store, something Netflix couldn't offer. By the end of 2006, Blockbuster Online had reached 3.6 million subscribers. Netflix had 7 million. The gap was narrowing, not widening. The program was bleeding Netflix of customers at a rate that alarmed Reed Hastings. In a leaked email, Hastings reportedly called it the most significant threat Netflix had ever faced. This is the part of the story that should sit uncomfortably. Because failure was not inevitable. Blockbuster had the brand, the infrastructure, the customer base, and, briefly, a product that was genuinely competitive. Then the board removed John Antioco. The investor Carl Icahn, who held a major stake, had clashed with Antioco over his compensation and the cost of the digital strategy. Antioco's replacement, Jim Keyes, looked at the Total Access program, which was growing but expensive, and made a decision that still defines how business schools teach competitive strategy. He cut it. "I've been frankly confused," Keyes said, "by this fascination that everybody has with Netflix." Within a year, Blockbuster Online was losing subscribers at the exact moment Netflix was accelerating. The gap that had been closing snapped open again, permanently. And this is the part of the story that most people skip. Blockbuster wasn't alone. Kodak's leadership in 2007 called digital photography not a viable business model. Borders dismissed e-books as a gimmick. Sears had the infrastructure to become Amazon. Every single one of them saw the future and chose the present instead. This isn't a story about one bad decision. It's a pattern, and it's older than any of these companies. Back to Blockbuster. On September 23, 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. The filing listed $1.46 billion in debt. 9,000 stores had become a few hundred. 60 million members had become a memory. The stores closed one by one over the years that followed. The blue and yellow signs came down. The parking lots emptied for the last time. Except one. In Bend, Oregon, there is still a Blockbuster. It's still open. People drive from across the country to visit it, not to rent a movie, but to stand inside something that used to be everywhere and now exists almost nowhere. The owner has kept it running carefully, because the people who remember what Friday night used to feel like still want a place to stand in it. Netflix, which Blockbuster could have owned for $50 million in 2000, was valued at roughly $200 billion by 2020. The last Blockbuster's annual revenue is difficult to calculate exactly, but it is, in every meaningful way, a very different number than $200 billion. But here is the question this story is actually asking. Not, why did Blockbuster fail? We know why. The question is, how do you know if you are the Blockbuster? How does an institution, a company, a career, a way of doing things, recognize when its greatest strengths have become the walls of a trap? That question doesn't have a clean answer. But the people who've learned to ask it early enough, that's a different kind of story entirely. Here's one more thing worth knowing before you go. John Antioco, the man who may or may not have laughed at that $50 million offer, later wrote in the Harvard Business Review that Blockbuster's failure wasn't the Netflix meeting. It was the board's decision to cut the digital strategy in 2007, just when it was working. In his view, the company didn't fail because it couldn't see the future. It failed because the people who could see it were replaced by the people who were comfortable with the present. He filed that article in 2011. By then, Netflix had over 20 million subscribers. If you want to understand why the same pattern keeps repeating across industries, across generations, across the full range of human ambition, this is where that conversation lives. And the next story? It's about a company that was handed a monopoly on the future and gave it away. Not by accident, by choice. And they knew exactly what they were doing.